Call 911. She's not breathing. Powerful waves crashed against the shore as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in blood orange. A girl lay motionless on the cold sand. Daniel Hayes sprinted toward her. Beside him, his young daughter watched in terror, her small hands trembling. There were no lifeguards in sight. Nobody knew what to do. Daniel knelt in the wet sand. He began chest compressions, then leaned down. The moment his lips touched hers to give her breath, the world seemed to freeze. Seconds later, the girl opened her eyes, but her first words left Daniel paralyzed. Daniel Hayes was 35 years old, but the deep, weathered lines around his eyes suggested he had lived through a century of storms. He lived in a small, salt-battered cottage on the far edge of a quiet coastal town, a place where everyone knew your name, but nobody bothered to learn your secrets. Daniel was a single father. His entire universe revolved around his 8-year-old daughter, Mia. Mia was a bright, energetic child with her mother's curly hair and a heart that was far too big for her small, delicate frame. She was the reason Daniel woke up every morning, even when the memories of the past felt like a lead weight in his chest. Daniel worked as a senior maintenance man at the Cerulean Bay Resort, the most expensive destination in the state. It was a demanding, physically exhausting job that required him to be a jack of all trades. He spent his long days fixing leaking pipes under marble floors, painting miles of white fences, and maintaining the sprawling, exotic gardens for wealthy tourists. The pay was barely enough to cover the mounting utility bills and Mia's school supplies, but Daniel never complained. He took a silent pride in his manual labor, believing that a man's true worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and his integrity, not the balance in his bank account. Ever since his wife, Sarah, had passed away 5 years ago, Daniel had withdrawn into a shell of protective silence. He avoided the town's social gatherings at the local pub and kept his head down while walking through the market. He didn't want the pitying looks or the hollow sympathy of the neighbors. He just wanted to provide Mia with a safe, stable, and happy life. Mia, however, was his bridge to the living world. She was the one who dragged him out of his quiet, brooding moods, constantly reminding him that there was still light and laughter to be found in the world. She would often leave little drawings in his lunchbox or sing popular songs while he tried to fix the kitchen sink. Their favorite daily ritual was a long walk along the jagged shoreline every evening after Daniel finished his late shift. It was their sacred time to talk about their day, to dream about the future, and to simply breathe in the crisp, salt-tinged air of the Atlantic. Daniel always taught Mia the same fundamental lesson. If you see someone in trouble, Mia, you help them. You don't wait for permission. You don't ask about their status. You just do what's right, because that's what a Hayes does. He wanted her to grow up with a spine made of cold rolled steel and a heart made of pure gold. Their life was incredibly simple, but it was undeniably full. They didn't have the luxury of cable TV or the latest gadgets, but they had a shelf full of well-worn books and a deck of cards. Daniel often looked at the massive, multi-million-dollar yachts anchored in the shimmering bay and felt not a single spark of envy. He had everything he needed right there, holding his hand as they skipped smooth stones across the crashing surf. He was a man who lived comfortably in the shadows, perfectly content to be invisible to the world. But Daniel Hayes was far from the ordinary man that townspeople saw. Beneath the grease-stained navy jumpsuit of a resort maintenance worker was a set of elite skills he had spent years trying to bury. He was a decorated veteran of a specialized emergency response unit, a man who had been trained to keep his heart rate low and his mind sharp when everyone else was screaming in panic. He had seen the darkest parts of humanity and the brightest flashes of heroism, and he had chosen this life of quiet coastal service specifically to escape the constant noise of his previous life. He thought he had left the heroics behind him in the dust of overseas deployments. On this particular afternoon, the atmosphere felt heavy and unsettled. The wind was picking up speed, whipping the sand into miniature cyclones, and the tide was surging in much faster than the local charts predicted. The beach was nearly deserted as the golden light began to fail. Daniel and Mia were walking near a rocky outcrop known as the Devil's Teeth, Mia laughing joyfully as she chased a stubborn, one-legged seagull. The peace of the moment was absolute, almost cinematic. The rhythmic, thunderous sound of the ocean was like the heartbeat of the earth, There was no physical sign that within 10 minutes, Daniel's carefully constructed life of anonymity would be shattered into pieces. There was no warning from the universe that he was about to be forced back into the spotlight, using the very skills he had tried to leave in the past. As they neared the edge of a deep tidal pool, Mia suddenly stopped running. Her laughter died away instantly, replaced by a sharp, terrified intake of breath. She pointed a small, shaking finger toward a dark mass caught in the rocks. Daniel followed her gaze, and in that moment, his blood turned to ice. A human figure was slumped in the shallows, being tossed like a discarded rag doll by the incoming, aggressive tide. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Daniel didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat. The maintenance man vanished, and the first responder returned. He told Mia to stay exactly where she was on the high sand and sprinted into the freezing, churning water. The waves fought him, pulling at his heavy work boots, but he pushed through the surf until he reached the figure. It was a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, dressed in expensive designer running gear. Her face was a ghostly, translucent pale, and her lips were already tinged with a sickly shade of blue. He dragged her limp body onto the dry sand, his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He laid her flat and immediately checked for a carotid pulse. Nothing. He leaned his ear toward her mouth to check for breathing. Nothing. She was clinically dead, her lungs filled with the very ocean she had been running beside. Daniel looked up at the empty, darkening beach. He checked his phone with wet fingers. No signal, as usual for this stretch of coast. The nearest professional lifeguard station was over a mile away. He was her only chance at seeing tomorrow. "Mia, get my phone and keep trying to call 911. Get to the high ground," Daniel shouted over the roar of the wind. He began the rhythmic, powerful compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted aloud in a steady cadence, the old military training manual playing like a high-definition movie in the back of his mind. He was locked in the zone, his movements precise, heavy, and relentless. He was no longer the man who fixed broken sinks. He was the operator fighting for a soul. As the minutes ticked by and the physical toll of CPR began to set in, a few people walking in the distance began to notice the commotion and gather around. They saw a man in a rough, dirty jumpsuit hovering over a beautiful, well-dressed woman. They didn't see a life-saving hero. They saw a stranger in a desperate, questionable situation. "What is that man doing to her?" a woman whispered, her voice sharp with suspicion and class-based bias. Is he hurting her? He's being so rough," an older man asked, reaching for his own phone to record the scene rather than help. The whispers grew into a low, poisonous hum of judgment. In their eyes, Daniel was a rough, working-class local, and the woman was clearly a person of immense wealth and status. The invisible social divide was visible even here, on the neutral, shifting ground of the sand. Daniel ignored them completely. His focus was a laser beam directed at the woman's chest. He had to give her the breath she couldn't take herself. He tilted her head back with a practiced motion, pinched her nose, and covered her cold mouth with his. It was the kiss of life, a clinical, desperate attempt to force vital oxygen into her failing, waterlogged lungs. To the uneducated onlookers, it looked like a scene from a romantic drama, or perhaps something much more inappropriate. "Hey, stop that right now! You're not a doctor!" someone shouted from the back of the small crowd. Daniel didn't even flinch at the accusation. He stayed in the rhythm, his own lungs burning from the exertion and his arms starting to shake with fatigue. He knew that if he stopped for even 10 seconds to argue, she was gone forever. He looked at her face. She was young, with fine features and a life that was likely filled with every luxury imaginable. But here on the sand, her money meant nothing. Only Daniel's breath mattered. Mia stood by her father's side, her eyes wide with a mixture of raw fear and immense pride. She saw the judgmental, hateful looks of the adults around them. She heard their nasty, whispered comments about her father's intentions. But she knew her daddy. She knew he was the best man in the world. "He's saving her. Can't you see?" Mia cried out, her voice small but fierce, echoing against the cliffs. "My daddy is a hero! Help him!" But the crowd remained skeptical. Rooted in a world where people didn't do difficult things for free, they lived in a modern world of lawsuits, liability, in cynical intentions. One man, wearing an expensive patio outfit, even tried to step forward to pull Daniel away by the shoulder. Daniel's intense, focused gaze snapped toward him for a fraction of a second, and the look in his eyes was so predatory and authoritative that the man recoiled in shock. "If you touch me," Daniel growled between measured breaths, "she dies. Stand back and give us air." The authority in Daniel's voice was absolute and undeniable. For a long, heavy moment, the crowd went silent, the only sound being the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of Daniel's hands and the whistling wind. Time became elastic, stretching each second into an eternity. Daniel's jumpsuit was completely soaked through with sweat and icy seawater. His pectoral muscles were screaming for him to stop, his vision starting to blur at the edges. But then he felt it, a tiny, erratic flutter beneath his palms, a microscopic gasp. The woman's chest suddenly heaved under his hands. She coughed violently, bringing up a mouthful of salt water and sand. Daniel immediately rolled her onto her side in the recovery position, clearing her airway of the remaining fluid. He supported her head as she struggled to take her first ragged breaths, her entire body shaking with the violent shock of returning to life. The crowd gasped in unison. The suspicion and judgment vanished instantly, replaced by a stunned, embarrassed silence. They had just witnessed a genuine miracle performed by a man they had been ready to condemn to a prison cell just minutes before. Daniel watched her eyes. They fluttered open slowly, unfocused, glassy, and filled with the confusion of a person who had touched the other side. She looked at him, really looked at him, deep into his soul. For a moment, the world around them ceased to exist. It was just the two of them on that darkening beach, the maintenance man and the billionaire heiress. The silence was broken only by her shallow, struggling breathing. Then she spoke. Her voice was a mere raspy whisper, but it carried the weight of a thunderbolt that changed Daniel's life forever. "Would you step in, like Daniel, or wait for help?" Comment, "Help or wait." You saved me," she whispered, her fingers weakly clutching the fabric of Daniel's wet jumpsuit. Her eyes were locked onto his with a terrifying intensity. Daniel exhaled a long breath he felt he'd been holding for 5 years. "Just breathe, miss. You're okay now. Help is on the way." Suddenly, the rhythmic roar of powerful engines cut through the salt air. Two massive armored black SUVs tore across the sand, kicking up plumes of dust. They stopped just yards away, their headlights blinding the crowd. A team of men in dark tactical suits burst out with military precision, followed by a frantic, older man in a tailored wool coat. They pushed through the gawking crowd with an air of absolute, terrifying authority. "Olivia!" the older man screamed, falling to his knees in the sand beside the girl. The men in suits immediately surrounded Daniel. They didn't offer a hand to help him up. They didn't thank him. Instead, they looked at him with icy, professional hostility. They saw a man in a dirty uniform hovering over their primary asset. "Get back! Hands where we can see them," one of the security guards barked, physically shoving Daniel away from the girl. Daniel stumbled, his boots sinking into the wet, treacherous sand. He reached out to grab Mia, pulling her into his side as the security team formed a living wall of muscle and Kevlar between him and the woman he had just brought back from the dead. "He was touching her! We saw him!" someone in the crowd shouted, the suspicion returning now that the important people had arrived to validate their biases. "He was doing CPR, but it looked wrong, very wrong." The lead security officer, a man with a scarred jaw, turned his predatory gaze toward Daniel. He saw the wet jumpsuit, the grease under the fingernails, and the humble, weathered appearance. He sneered with a mix of disgust and power. "Did you put your hands on Miss Carter?" the officer demanded, his hand hovering dangerously near the holstered pistol on his hip. Daniel stood his ground, though his heart was heavy with the realization of what was happening. "I performed life-saving CPR. She drowned. She wasn't breathing." The officer looked at the girl, Olivia Carter, the sole heiress to the multi-billion-dollar Carter Industries empire. She was being wrapped in a high-tech thermal blanket, her father hovering over her like a frantic shadow. "We'll decide if your intervention was appropriate or an assault," the officer hissed, leaning into Daniel's space. "You're lucky we don't have you arrested and thrown in a cage right now. Do you have any idea who this family is?" You just touched royalty with those filthy hands. Daniel looked at Mia. She was crying now, clutching his leg, confused and terrified by why these powerful men were being so mean to her father after he did something good. Daniel felt a surge of righteous anger, but he suppressed it. He knew the world of the powerful. It was a world of optics, not truth. I know she was a human being who needed help, Daniel said quietly, his voice like gravel. The crowd watched, murmuring in agreement with the guards. They were back to judging him. They saw a billionaire's daughter and a low-level resort worker. They saw a potential headline, a scandal, a lawsuit. They saw everything except the miracle that had just occurred. Olivia, still incredibly weak and trembling, tried to sit up against her father's wishes. She looked past her father, past the wall of dark suits, searching for the man with the steady hands and the calming voice. "Wait," she called out, her voice still raspy and wet. "Father, wait! He gave me breath. He saved me." Her father, Arthur Carter, looked at Daniel for the first time. He didn't see a hero. He saw a liability. He saw a man who had seen his daughter in a moment of ultimate vulnerability. "We'll handle this, Olivia," Arthur said, his voice cold and final. "Security, clear the area. Let the actual paramedics do their job." The ambulance arrived then, its sirens wailing as it bounced across the sand. The paramedics pushed through the crowd, and the security team moved Olivia toward the gurney, effectively erasing Daniel from the scene. He stood in the damp sand, invisible once again, a ghost in the presence of kings. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Olivia looked back one last time. She saw the single dad holding his little girl, standing alone under the dying light of the sunset. She saw the integrity in his eyes and the exhaustion in his posture. And then the doors slammed shut, and she was gone. The crowd dispersed quickly following the excitement. Daniel and Mia were left alone on the darkening beach. The miracle was over, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of being fundamentally misunderstood. "Daddy, why were they so mean? You fixed her," Mia asked, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Daniel knelt down in the sand and hugged her with everything he had. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, Maya. And sometimes they're afraid of being in debt, but we did the right thing. That's the only reward we need. That's the Hayes way." He picked her up, her head resting on his shoulder, and began the long, silent walk back to their cottage. He didn't want a medal. He didn't want a news story. He just wanted to disappear back into the shadows. But the world of the Carters has a way of finding people who try to hide. Arthur Carter was a man who hated debts he couldn't control with a checkbook. And Olivia Carter is a woman who couldn't forget the taste of the air given to her by a stranger. Daniel Hayes thought the story ended on that beach. He was wrong. It was only the beginning of a collision between two worlds that were never, ever meant to meet. For the next few days, Daniel went back to his routine. He scrubbed the algae from the resort pools, he fixed the broken AC units in the VIP suites, and he strictly avoided the news. He didn't want to see the glowing headlines about the Carter heiress's miraculous recovery. He didn't want to see his own face, captured by a bystander's blurry phone camera, labeled as the mysterious local worker. But at the resort, the whispers were already everywhere. His supervisor looked at him with a new kind of suspicion. His co-workers avoided his gaze in the break room. Daniel felt the pressure building. He felt the judgment of a town that couldn't believe a simple maintenance man would act without a selfish motive or a hidden agenda. He focused entirely on Mia. He focused on the simple, quiet beauty of their life. He told himself that the beach was just a dream, a moment of temporary madness that would eventually fade away. But every time he closed his eyes to sleep, he felt the faint, ghostly flutter of that heartbeat beneath his palms. He felt the heavy responsibility of a life saved and the nagging feeling that the ocean wasn't done with him yet. Do you think people judge Daniel too quickly? Tell us your thoughts below. 3 days later, a silver Rolls-Royce, a car that cost more than Daniel's entire neighborhood, pulled into the dusty gravel driveway of Daniel's maintenance shed. It was jarringly out of place among the rusted lawnmowers, bags of fertilizer, and old wooden pallets. Daniel was in the middle of sharpening a heavy set of hedge trimmers when the car door opened. Olivia Carter stepped out. She looked completely different from the girl on the sand, vibrant, healthy, and draped in a casual elegance that whispered of unimaginable wealth. Her hair was perfect, her skin glowing, but her eyes were exactly the same. They were the eyes that had looked at him with absolute clarity on the sand. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice clear, warm, and carrying a natural authority. Daniel stood up slowly, wiping his greasy, stained hands on a ragged cloth. "Miss Carter, you should be resting. The ocean isn't something you bounce back from in a weekend." "I've rested enough," she replied, walking closer, ignoring the dirt on the ground. "My father wants to send you a check, a very large one. He wants to buy your silence and make the situation go away so it doesn't affect the stock price." Daniel stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I don't want his money. I didn't save you for a check, and I have nothing to say to the press. Tell him to keep his millions." Olivia smiled, and it was a genuine, beautiful thing that reached her eyes. "I told him you'd say exactly that. He doesn't understand people like you, Daniel. He thinks everything has a price tag. But I understand. I felt your hands shaking on the beach." Before Daniel could respond, the resort's general manager came running out of the main office, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Mr. Hayes, thank God you're still here. The main power transformer for the VIP wing just blew. We have 2 sitting senators and a tech mogul in the dark. The backup systems aren't syncing, and the grid is overheating." Daniel looked at the manager, then at Olivia. The professional technician in him, the man who knew every wire in this building, took over. "Did you check the phase alignment on the secondary circuit? If that's off, the backup won't trigger." "The specialized engineers from the city are stumped," the manager cried. "They say it'll take 6 hours to bypass." Daniel didn't say another word. He grabbed his heavy tool bag and headed toward the concrete utility vault, Olivia following closely behind him, curious to see the man in his element. Inside the dark, humming vault, the resort's high-paid, top-tier engineers were arguing over a complex digital console. They looked at Daniel, the janitor, with blatant, unprofessional contempt as he entered. "Stand back, Hayes," the lead engineer snapped, not even looking up. "This is high-voltage infrastructure. You'll hurt yourself or blow the whole wing." Daniel ignored the insult. He pushed past the suits and knelt in front of the primary terminal. He didn't look at the flashing error codes on the screen. He looked at the physical wiring. His eyes scanned the copper and the insulation until he saw it. A tiny scorched bypass that the experts had overlooked because it wasn't on their digital diagnostics. He pulled a small, battered multimeter from his belt. He worked with a speed and a mechanical precision that made the arguing engineers go suddenly silent. Within 3 minutes, he manually reconfigured the load-bearing sequence and flipped a heavy manual override. The hum of the vault changed instantly from a jagged, dangerous grind to a smooth, healthy purr. Upstairs, the lights flickered and roared back to life. The lead engineer stared at the console in total disbelief. "How did you—" "That configuration hasn't been in the manuals for 20 years. It's a legacy military-grade failsafe. Where did you learn that?" Daniel stood up, slung his bag over his shoulder, and turned toward the door. "Sometimes the old ways are better than the software," he said simply. Olivia watched him from the shadows of the vault, her eyes wide with a new kind of realization. She didn't see a maintenance man anymore. She saw a master of his craft. She saw a man who had been intentionally hiding a brilliant, tactical mind behind a humble uniform and a quiet life. "You're far more than a repairman, Daniel," she whispered as they walked back out into the blinding coastal sun. "I'm a dad, Miss Carter," Daniel replied, his voice firm. "That's the only title that truly matters in the end." Should Daniel accept Olivia's help now? Comment yes or no. Olivia stood by her silver car, her gaze lingering on Daniel as he returned to his tools. "You know," she said softly, "I've spent the last 3 days feeling a strange pull, like I've known you forever. It's more than just the beach, it's a feeling, in my very bones. Why do you look at me like you've already seen me die once before?" Daniel was silent for a long time, the only sound being the wind in the trees. He looked out at the churning ocean, then back at her. 10 years ago, he began, his voice dropping to a low, haunting register. There was a massive multi-car pileup on the I-95 during a summer black ice storm. Olivia froze in place. Her breath hitched and her hand went to her throat. The accident that took my mother, the night the world ended for me. I was the first responder on that scene, Daniel said, his eyes distant. I wasn't a maintenance man back then. I was a lead paramedic for the city. I pulled a young girl out of a burning red sedan just seconds before the fuel tank went. I carried her across the highway through the fire and handed her to a state trooper. Olivia's eyes filled with hot tears. The trooper said a man saved me, a man who disappeared back into the rain and smoke before anyone could get his name or his badge number. I've searched for that man for a decade, Daniel. My father spent millions trying to find him. I didn't want to be found, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. That night was the reason I quit the force. I couldn't save everyone in that pileup. I couldn't save your mother. I chose a quiet life by the sea so I wouldn't have to carry that weight of failing anymore. Olivia reached out and touched his hand, the same calloused, steady hand that had saved her twice, once from the fire of the highway and once from the ice of the sea. You've been my guardian angel your whole life, Daniel Hayes, she whispered. The universe won't let you hide anymore. You were born to save people. Mia ran out of the maintenance shed then, grabbing Daniel's wang and looking up at the beautiful lady. Olivia knelt down to the little girl's level and smiled through her tears. Mia, did you know your daddy is the single bravest man I've ever met? He saved me a long time ago, and he saved me again today. The connection between them was instant and electric. Mia's natural warmth and Olivia's profound gratitude began to bridge the massive gap between their two worlds. Daniel felt the heavy, icy walls he had built around his heart finally begin to crumble under the sun. He realized that you can't run from your true purpose. And sometimes the people you save are the very ones who were sent by fate to save you from yourself. Daniel Hayes never viewed himself as a hero or a man of legend. In his mind, he was just a father doing what was necessary to protect his child and his hard-earned peace. But life has a powerful way of proving that true character is revealed in the quiet moments when nobody is watching and when there is absolutely nothing to gain. He didn't save Olivia because she was a billionaire. He saved her because she was a human soul in desperate need of breath. And in return, the universe brought back a 10-year-old debt of kindness that had been floating in the ether, waiting for the right moment to land. The story of the single dad and the heiress reminds us that kindness is never a wasted effort. It is a seed planted in the dark that eventually, inevitably finds its way to the light. It teaches us that status, wealth, and power are just smoke and mirrors. What truly matters is the steady hand we offer to those who are falling. Sometimes a single act of courage doesn't just save a physical life. It mends a broken soul and builds a bridge to a future you never thought possible. If you believe that one moment of kindness can truly change a life forever, subscribe to Hidden Heart Stories for more powerful stories about everyday heroes. Thank you for watching, and remember, the world is fixed by those who choose to care.